Confident, confident, confident. I can be confident, 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 confident. I can be confident at work.
Hello and welcome to episode 109 of the Confident at Work podcast. I'm your host and your confidence coach, Anna Manning. And today we're talking about worrying about what people think at work. I've had a recent example of this. So you may have noticed that there is a jingle, like a theme song at the beginning of the podcast. Confident, confident, I can be confident at work. Yes, you know the one. You may have noticed, if you're a listener to the podcast, that just slipped its way into the podcast about 5 episodes ago. About a year ago, I happened to casually mention to someone, "Oh, do you know, I'd love like a theme song for the podcast. I'd love like a little jingle." I used to listen to this local radio station called Hallam FM. If you lived near Sheffield in the UK, you may have listened to Hallam FM. Anyway, I used to listen to Hallam FM when I was a kid, and they had these little jingles. I loved them, and they really stuck in my head. But when I told this person, "Oh, I'm thinking of having a jingle for the podcast," they like screwed their nose up and kind of said, "Oh, that's really naff." And I was like, "Oh, maybe that is naff." So I didn't go ahead with it. I put it on the shelf. A year later, I listened to this brilliant podcast and they have this cool little theme song, this cool little jingle at the beginning of their podcast. And I was like, no, this is a good idea, and I'm going to have my own. Anyway, I looked up the woman who wrote it. She was in New York. Her name is Melissa. Shout out to Melissa at Making Audio Magic if you want your own theme song. So fast forward, I've got the mix. We're ready to go. I'm thinking about putting it on the next podcast episode, and suddenly I'm worrying about what everybody is going to think. Now, I'm not an excessive worrier about what everyone's going to think. I would say a lot of my clients are. That is a particular affliction for them. It's not a particular affliction for me generally, but everyone has those moments. We all have those moments where we suddenly become aware of what everyone else might be thinking in relation to something that we're doing or not doing. And that was what happened to me when I put out this podcast jingle. I was suddenly like, what is everybody going to think? And I noticed it because it was quite unusual for me to think like that. And I coach on this fairly frequently, like worrying, what feels like excessive worrying about what people are going to think at work. And obviously, I'm not immune to that. I worried about what you would think about this podcast jingle. I wondered if you would think, "Oh my God, that is so naff. That is rubbish." Like, I worried about what you would think. And then I realized that you might think all kinds of things. You might think nothing. You might not have even noticed. You might have thought, "Oh, that's cool, like a little podcast jingle, nice." Or you might have thought, "That is a bit naff, but never mind. I like the podcast and I'm going to carry on listening to it." Or you might have thought, "That is so naff. I'm never going to listen to that podcast ever again." The point is that I wasted my time getting in your head and trying to figure out what you would think. What a waste of my time. So if you find yourself, like me, worrying about what people are going to think at work, either about something you've done, something you've not done, something you've produced, something that you've said, some failure that you've had, some success that you've had, even, you're not alone. And in this podcast episode, I'm going to try and help you see what's going on under the hood when you're, I'm going to say, excessively worrying about what people think, but take that to mean we all worry about what people think sometimes. It's normal. But this is the kind of excessive worry, you'll know if this is you, that actually just gets you down and gets in your way and probably is pretty annoying and exhausting for you at work. So why do any of us care about what people think? Well, we're social creatures, right? We live in society, we live in community, we live in family, we live in workplaces, we have colleagues, we have clients. All of us have to work by forming and maintaining relationships with people. That's a given if you're a human. Very few people take themselves off to live in the wilderness as a hermit. We are connected, we are in community. There is a risk that people will have thoughts about the stuff that we do. And for some of us, that leads to this position where we're constantly in the heads of other people, wondering and worrying about what it is they might be thinking about us at any given moment. And this worrying about what people think was part of the low confidence cycle. Now, if you don't know, the low confidence cycle and the high confidence cycle is a tool that I've created to help you identify habits and behaviors that will keep your confidence lower at work, and habits and behaviors you probably want to adopt if you want your confidence to be higher. I will leave a link in the show notes so you can look at them. But this is actually in there. Excessive worrying about what people think at work is already in that low confidence cycle. It just has a slightly different name. So there's three parts to the low confidence cycle. The first one is how you manage yourself, so your self-management. The second one is around standards, so the standards you set for yourself. And the third one is around feedback and acknowledgement. And this worrying about what people think is self-management. So poor self-management probably for most people includes how you are being perceived. So, an excessive focus on how you're being perceived. I want you to think about if this is you and you worry a lot about what other people are thinking, where and how it has an impact for you in your workday. So, we're going to get to what's this all about and then what you can do about it. But first, I want us to check in and take a minute to think about where is it happening? And I'm going to share a few places where my clients have told me that excessive worrying about what people think is coming up for them. So you just see if you can tick any of these. So the first thing that I see is I have an idea to share. I have something I want to say, but I'm worrying about what people will think about the idea, about me, about my delivery. So I'm really checking that contribution before I speak. Then I may be excessively worrying about the contribution after I've spoken. And that might be tearing the contribution to shreds in my mind, ruminating, going back over things. Why did I say that? What will they think? How did I look? How's that coming across? Is that going to have an impact on my reputation? And let me tell you that not all of this is going to be that obvious to you. All that worry about reputation and how it's going to look and the impact it's going to have on you, it probably isn't that obvious to you that that's what you're actually thinking. It'll just be this weird, like, cloud of worry that will probably overtake you. But when I've lifted the lid with clients, that's actually what's underneath it. Another example is putting yourself out for an opportunity that you want. You might think, oh, what are people going to think? They're going to think, what's she doing that for? Or why has he got that role? Or somebody else would do that better. There's all those moments around putting yourself out there, whether it's for an opportunity, a project, a job, a particular piece of work to lead something that you might worry about what other people are going to think in relation to that. Maybe it's around challenging. So, challenging a client, challenging your board, challenging your boss, challenging somebody in your organization, or challenging a societal issue, or someone who's being racist on the bus. All of those things can be difficult to do. And one of the difficulties can be I'm going to worry about what people are going to think about me if I do that. When you're doing something new, this might come up for you. Doing something for the first time, it's new. You don't know whether you can get it right. You don't know how it's going to turn out. You don't know if it's going to be perfect. And you may be worrying about what people are going to think about that. How are they going to perceive you? How are they going to think about you? Are you not going to be an expert in their mind anymore? Will they trust you? Will it damage your reputation? If you make a mistake, there may be excessive worry there about what people are going to think. And this is a flashpoint for a lot of people's confidence. What are people going to think if you make a mistake? How are they going to think about you? Will they pass over you for opportunities in the future? So, overall, you're probably getting from these examples that worrying about what people think can, not always, but it can become a driver in terms of the actions that you take or the actions that you don't take. So let's say that worry is all consuming. You may just not take the opportunity. You may just not say the thing. You may not give the challenge. You may work so excessively to make sure that you never make a mistake. And if you make one, you may cover it up. What is the level at which this impacts you? Does it actually prevent you or stop you from doing things? For some people, that is the case. For other people, it might be that they do the thing anyway, like they make the challenge, they say the contribution, they go for the thing, but that's accompanied by so much worrying about what other people think that it's exhausting and difficult for them to do those things. I've got clients in both camps, but just know what that is for you. And the impact of all that, it may stop you going for things, opportunities, promotions, or it may just hamper your efforts as you do them, exhaust you, cause you to lose focus, cause you to be in your head instead of present in where you're actually supposed to be. It may just turn you into an anxious mess that actually doesn't really enjoy your job anymore. Just know for you, where are the places where this pops up? And what is the impact on you? How does it feel to be you at work when you're worrying so much about what other people think? What's that like for you? What's it like to work under that kind of rumination and scrutiny? Can't imagine that it's easy. I imagine you've got a lot of challenges in your everyday, in your work life as it is, without all that being added onto the top of it. So, what's this all about? Why would we spend so much time worrying about what people think of us? And when I dived into this, there seems to be some common things that come out. Now, obviously, the first thing I said in the podcast was we're social creatures. We live in community. We live in workplaces. We have colleagues, etc. So there are people around, and we have to get on with those people if we're going to succeed. And that means that sometimes people are going to have thoughts about stuff that we do. That's a reality for most of us. They may not have as many thoughts as you think they do. And their thoughts may not be as harsh as you think they are. And I'm going to get onto a piece of research that seems to prove that this is the case. But we rely on others. We are connected with others. So we care about what other people think because it has an impact on us. Let's say we're excessively worrying about everything being perfect. Maybe underneath that, we actually don't want to lose face. We don't want to have our reputation tarnished or our reputation damaged. We want people to think of us as a competent professional. We want people to think of us as an expert. And we worry that if something is less than perfect, maybe they won't see us like that anymore. For a lot of us, our professional reputation is important. We've spent years focusing on it and cultivating it. It's not who we are, but it's what we do and we care about it. So we worry about that loss of respect and that loss of reputation. And if you look into the literature, psychologists think that a lot of it stems from a fear of rejection from society, community, workplace, fear of rejection from our professional standing. Fear of rejection is very like primal instinct, I think, for humans. And if you listen to, the kind of pop psychology, that will tell you that rejection in early human species was a pretty dangerous thing. One of the reasons that humans were able to survive and evolve was because we are a communal species. Now, imagine the threat of being cast out into the cold. That probably means death. And I don't know the truth about this, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of that was so wired into our psyche that we don't realize that getting something wrong at work doesn't actually mean we're not going to be cast out into the wild and probably die. It feels painful to us, the idea of it. Even if it's not going to be practically painful, and you might say it is going to be practically painful if my reputation is ruined and I lose my job and my house and my friends and my family, right? Practically, that's going to be terrible, but it's an emotional pain I think we fear the most. Rejection feels crushing to us, whether that's in a social situation, in a professional situation. So it makes sense that we may have developed ways of ensuring that that rejection does not occur. And one of them might be this excessive worrying about what people think. Now, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm coming at this as a coach. But many, many times when I'm working with clients, I've helped them to get under the hood and really see, what are you actually afraid of? And when it comes down to it, in almost every one of those conversations, the end point is that you end up losing everything and everyone and being a bag lady or some flavor of that. And you're not going to be consciously aware of that in the moment. When you're excessively worrying about the comment that you made in that meeting, you're not going to connect it to the fact that you're really afraid of becoming a bag lady who's rejected by everyone. But when I go through it with clients and we say, what are you actually afraid of? Like, then what? Then what? Then what? And they're like, I'm going to end up as a bag lady all alone. Well, that's quite a frightening prospect for most people. And so maybe some of this excessive worrying is preventing that which you fear the most from actually happening. Or is it? A lot of the time, we've set up these adaptive coping mechanisms to prevent something that we're afraid of. But when we really get down to it and when we really start looking at them, we're like, is that even that effective? Does it even work to do that? Sometimes these habits and these protective patterns that we form end up actually being counterproductive. And in this case, I think this is one of them. Yes, you may want to care about what people think. You may want to care about your reputation. You may want to, have ways of evaluating your contribution and your progress. All of that is probably good. But this excessive worrying about what people think, I I don't see that working out that well for people. It's like something that's just tipped too far. And as you know, anything that's tipped too far can become a bit of a problem. I did some research on the research when I was making this podcast episode for you. And one of the really interesting ones that I read, it's actually quite old now, I guess, in research terms, because it's from 2001, but I couldn't actually find anything that updated it, but I thought it was interesting. And research piece was called Do Others Judge Us as Harshly as We Think? Overestimating the impact of our failures, shortcomings, and mishaps. And I'll leave a citation in the show notes so you can look at it if you want. But the abstract says when people suffer an embarrassing blunder, social mishap, or public failure, they often feel their image has been severely tarnished in the eyes of others. 4 studies demonstrate, so this was a meta analysis looking at 4 studies, that these fears are commonly exaggerated. So people who imagined committing one of several social blunders and people who experienced a public intellectual failure both thought that they would be judged more harshly by others than they actually were, which they say produced unnecessary social anxiety. So they overestimated how harshly people would judge them. And then they asked people to judge them, and they did, and it was less harsh. So I wonder whether that gives us a little clue that actually we might not even be that great at estimating how other people are thinking about us or how other people are judging us. In our mind, when we're excessively worrying, everyone's thinking about us, everyone's judging us, and probably in our head, that judgment is quite harsh. Well, the research suggests that we overestimate the level of judgment that people make and the harshness of the critique, which I thought was interesting. So, what to do if this is you and you're like, yeah, I worry probably excessively about what people think about me at work? I have a few ideas. Now, I'm not sitting down with you figuring this out as a two-way process, which if I was coaching with you individually, that's what I'd be doing. But I've raked through my brain, I've looked at the research, and I've thought about the times where I've coached individuals on this particular issue to pull out some things that I think would help you without me having to speak to you individually. And the thing I said about being afraid of becoming a bag lady who's completely rejected by everyone, that is a very common thing. So I don't think that this problem and the solutions to it are completely individual. I think it's part of a collective thing that a lot of people can feel the same and think the same about. So hopefully some of these tips are going to be useful to you. So what I want you to do first is figure out whether this worrying excessively about what people think is actually completely isolated or whether it's connected to a wider issue. And the way that you can do that really easily is to go and take the confidence assessment. So if you haven't already taken it, the confidence assessment is a free resource that's connected to the podcast. And what it enables you to do is check whether you're actually in a low confidence cycle. So I mentioned that low confidence cycle earlier, and it talks about self management, standards, and acknowledgement and feedback. As I said, worrying about what people think is in this first component, self management. But I want you to check and I want you to know for you whether worrying about what people think is just a part of that low confidence cycle. It's connected to another group of habits and behaviors which you need to be aware of. And if this excessive worrying about what people think is actually connected to a wider ecosystem of habits and behaviors which you can change, so figure that out. Is this isolated or is it part of a wider ecosystem of habits and behaviors which are keeping your confidence lower than it could be at work? The next thing that I think is useful is to actually verbalize, if you can, what's going on underneath. So when we're excessively worrying about what people think, my experience is that we may not even notice that that's really what's happening. We may notice that we're procrastinating on something. We may notice we're hesitating. We may notice that we're second guessing something or we're putting something off. If that's happening, what may be behind it is you worrying about what people are going to think. So you may not want to submit the piece of work. You may not want to commit to saying a particular thing, or you may not want to commit to a decision or a course of action, because you're worried about what people think. Now, this can be used in any setting, but here's my example to actually verbalize what's happening underneath. In my podcast jingle example, I noticed that I was like, maybe I'll do it next week. And I was like, what's actually going on there? Why would I do it next week? I could do it this week. I'd planned to do it this week. So I verbalized what's happening underneath. And I can't remember the exact words, but it sounds something like this. Right, Anna, what's going on here? Why are you putting it off until next week? And I say, I'm worried that people are going to think that it's stupid. I say, okay, and then what? And then I'm worried that they're going to stop listening to the podcast. Okay, and then what? And then I'm worried that nothing that I do is going to work and the business is going to end up failing. Okay, and then what? And then I am not going to be able to pay my mortgage. So I just verbalized what was actually going on underneath. And I might have said, which I didn't say, but now I'm listening to that, I can see what it actually was. And you might have already spotted it. 10 points if you have. I'm worried about people rejecting me. I'm fearful that people are going to reject me if I do this, if I put this out. I'm worried that people are going to reject me. Now, was that immediately obvious to me? No, I didn't even realize until I just said it to you now. I wasn't putting that podcast jingle out because I was worried that people were going to reject me because of a podcast jingle. And now I actually know that that's what that was the truth. That was verbalizing what was actually going on underneath. Now I can see, oh, do you know what? Actually, it's okay. It's a podcast jingle. If somebody rejects me because of it, then all right, I'll just get on with my life. Like, you can hear me now just coaching myself there. That's a freeing moment for me to actually realize what I was actually afraid of was you rejecting me. And once I could actually see that, I felt my tummy go. I felt I could take a deep breath in. You'll notice that my tone just changed. The thing I was actually afraid of is like, I don't actually have to be afraid of that. It's okay. And when I know it's okay, I can just put the podcast jingle out and go with it. So, can you verbalize what's happening underneath? And if it's to do with this excessive worry and you identify with that thing about being rejected, you could just maybe ask yourself, when you notice the worrying, what am I actually afraid of? What's actually going on here? Am I thinking that people are going to reject me if I say this a bit wrong? Or if this isn't perfect? Sometimes we just need to be acknowledged. Sometimes we just need to verbalize what's actually going on. And most of the time, that's quite hidden from us. So let's bring it out into the light instead of keeping it hiding. Because when we keep it hiding and we just keep pushing things off and throwing things to the end of our desk, metaphorically, that worrying will continue. It thrives in not being faced. So the next tip came from a former client of mine. And we had a very hilarious and wonderful time coaching. She excessively worried about what people thought. And I did check with her whether it was okay to share this on the podcast. And she said, yeah, sure, go for it. She decided that the way she would change the habit of this worrying about what everybody thought was she would just decide how many shits she had to give in a day. She was like, I've got a limited number of shits to give. And I was like, all right, how many have you got? And she was like, I've got 10 shits every day, no more. So I was like, fine. Well, what if you actually just create 10 little paper shits? And as the day goes on, they go in the toilet or in a bucket or whatever. And then you're out of shits. So she was like, all right then. And that's the kind of amazing thing that can happen when you're coaching. You can create some paper shits and use them to change people's habits or change your own habits. Anyway, it was so successful for her that I think you may want to use it. If you identify with this, like, I have a limited amount of shits to give. And this excessive worrying is like me casting my worrying shits everywhere and it is exhausting. Maybe decide actively, bring your conscious mind on board here and be like, right, how many shits do we actually have to give in any given day? What do you actually have the capacity for? You might say 10, you might say 5, you might say 20, whatever. Now, if you're going to do it in the way she did, which I think was really, really effective, she actually created the paper shits. And when she'd worried about what somebody was thinking on a particular issue before she did it or after she did it, she would put one of the shits in a bowl and then they were gone. And it showed her, one, how many shits she was actually giving, because at the beginning she was getting through 10 in a morning. But then she was getting through 10 in a day. And then she was getting through 10 in a week. And then she didn't even get through 10 in a month at the end of our coaching. Absolutely brilliant. So find a way, maybe like this client, to figure out how many shits you actually have to give, or whatever version of that works for you. Your mind might have just gone on a creative spark and thought of a way that you can do it. But really, what we're doing here is we're bringing it into conscious awareness. How many times is this actually happening? How many times do I actually have the capacity for this to happen? And let me notice where I'm spending my capacity, where I'm spending my shits, so that I can bring my conscious mind on board and be like, I'm sorry, but I've given a shit 4 times already this morning. And do let me know if you make some paper shits or tag me on social media and show me your paper shits that you make. I would be really pleased to see them. Or maybe you can just have 10 shit emojis on a document on your desktop and delete them as you go. Who knows? Anyway, I will leave that one with you. The next tip I have is to notice whether the thing you think somebody else is thinking, is it actually what you're thinking? Here's a recent example. I was coaching somebody who was due to be on a panel and there was going to be a Q&A, so question and answer session. And basically anyone from the audience could ask a question. They didn't know what the questions were going to be in advance. It wasn't scripted, so they were just there live as experts to, answer questions and get debate going, etc. And this client was really nervous about that because she was like, I can't prep. I don't know what they're going to ask me. So we went through it and I was like, well, what are you afraid would happen? And this client, again, who's given their permission for me to mention this on the podcast, said, well, I'm worried that I won't know an answer to a question. I'm like, well, what would happen if you didn't? Well, everyone will think that I'm rubbish at my job if I don't know how to answer a question. And I said, Will you be thinking that? If you can't answer a question, will you be thinking, I'm rubbish at my job? And she said, well, yeah. So I had to point out to her that so far, the only person that we know who's definitely thinking that is you. We don't know about those other people in the audience. The only person who was definitely thinking she was rubbish at her job if she couldn't answer a question was her. But she was not aware of that before we coached through that. Now, you want to ask yourself this question. Is it them that are thinking that? Or is it actually me? And then ask the question like I did with her. Okay, so are you actually rubbish at your job if you can't answer a question? And she said, no. And I was like, interesting. So you were nervous and worried about what people were going to be thinking. Turns out the only one thinking it was actually you. And when you actually examined it, you didn't even believe it was true anyway. We had good fun and she had a great Q&A because she let me know by email. So the next tip I have for you is to notice that sometimes this excessive worrying about what people think can lead you to try and control what they think, which for the most part is probably a very fruitless endeavor. You might be able to influence what you're thinking, although question mark whether you can even do that most of the time, because most of the time, as you may have noticed in this podcast episode, you don't even know what the hell you're thinking. Your unconscious mind's doing all kinds of cartwheels in the background and you're oblivious. We're all oblivious. So you trying to control the minds of other people by worrying about what they think and therefore acting or behaving in a certain way to get them to think about you in a certain way. Oof, the mind games. You'd have to be like some Darren Brown trying to control everyone's mind, some kind of like amazing like mentalist, hypnotist, cult leader, whatever. When you're doing this excessive worrying about what people are going to think, you will be subtly making little manipulations all over the place to try and get people to think in a certain way. But oh my gosh, for you, how exhausting. And actually, how good are you even at doing that? How good even are you at manipulating what people think? You cannot control what people think. And you may have been trying for a really long time to control what everyone's thinking around you all the time. Well, maybe it just isn't your job, my dear. Maybe it just isn't your job. What if you could just let people think what they think? They're going to anyway. But what if you'd be like, okay, I allow you, everybody around me in my world, I allow you to think what you think. They're going to do it anyway. What if you just allow it? What does that create for you? How much more free are you? Imagine if that was in your job description. Control what everybody thinks about you at all times. You'd be like, well, that's not really achievable. But when you're excessively worrying about what other people think and you're taking a lot of action or not taking action because of it, that literally is in your job description. Maybe just let them think what they're going to think and leave that particular bullet point of bullshit out of your job description. Okay, that's what I have for you this week. I hope it was helpful. If you want to come and work with me directly, you can come and do private coaching one-on-one. I will leave a link in the show notes where you can click through and book a time in my diary. I give you a 60-minute call and go through what your particular challenges are, where you would like to get to, and I help you to understand what patterns and behaviors you're going to need to shift in order to get where you want. As a first off, I recommend that you go and take that confidence assessment. It is free and it is really going to help you to start getting under your own hood in relation to the confidence stuff that we talk about on the podcast. The doors to the members club will open again in September. So look out and wait out for that if you're a female professional and you might want to come and join us inside the members club. The other thing that you can do is just tap through and give the podcast a review or a rating, even if it's just a star rating. Apparently, it really helps. I enjoyed spending time with you this week. I hope you enjoyed it too. And I hope you enjoy the jingle, which is the outro. But even if you don't, it's going to be there anyway. See you next week. Bye.
Confidence, confident, confident, I can be confident, 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 confident.